The Vervist Manifesto by James Finlay. Introduction. This begins with the night I first got drunk. I never got invited to parties by schoolmates. That is to say, I did, but not the kind of parties that come to mind when one talks of high school parties. It was a month or two after we'd all graduated, and a friend of mine extended an invitation to me. Because I was new to these more debaucherous affairs, I brought a bottle of wine with me, rather than a more traditional six-pack of beer. I was the only person there who drank red wine at the age of 18, and I was left to drink the entire bottle myself, along with several beers donated by people who found out that I'd never been drunk before. After hours of swigging and cries of, "In the name of science!" I found myself cast in the setup to a joke. A drunk Christian, a tipsy atheist, and a sober Buddhist are sitting in the grass together. It was a setup without a real punchline, and it's something I've revisited over the last decade, trying to figure out what its middle and end might be. This piece is not all that humorous, but it's the closest thing I've got to a full story. On the night in question, we were talking philosophy and religion, as I've been in the habit of doing whenever I've been drinking since. I don't remember the conversation, but I remember where it ended. We came to the conclusion that we all had more in common than we had differences, and that if people of different belief systems, such as ourselves, could put aside their differences, everything would be dandy. I remember waking up with the sun the next morning and feeling stupid for thinking that what we had realized was such a radical new idea. It has taken me another decade to make peace with the fact that while this is not a new idea, it is a truth that must be told again and again. That's the thing about the truth. It's always been true, and it's hubris to believe that you're the first person to find it. But when you do find it, it's important to share what you've found, because there are many different aspects and no one has the whole picture. I've come across an image that I think illustrates what I'm talking about. There's a parable, originating in the subcontinent, about a village of blind people who have an elephant arrive in their streets. The people gather round it and begin describing what the creature is like as they explore it through touch. One person has the trunk and says it's very dexterous and keen to interact with the things around it. Another has its tail and agrees in part with the first person, but talks mostly about the hairs at the end. A third has its leg and understands the elephant to be like the trunk of a tree. In some tellings of the parable, the people come to blows over their differences. I prefer to tell the story as though the blind people are children, excitedly telling each other about what they have found. Anyway, this is my experience of the elephant. This is my punchline to that joke. I'm calling it Vervism. A drunk Christian, a tipsy atheist, and a sober Buddhist are sitting in the grass together. Philosophical underpinnings. Vervism deals largely with the pre-rational. As such, I unfortunately have to start with metaphysics. I tried to write around this bit, but it's really necessary. Don't worry, I'll do everything I can to keep it engaging and easy to follow, or at the very least, I'll be brief. Metaphysics can get you bogged down in arguments like, does reality as we know it really exist per se, or can anything be true? I'm going to start from the assumption that reality and truth are things that exist and that we can come into some kind of contact with them. Understanding truth and reality is a different matter, however. Reality, objectively speaking, is abstract, nebulous, and therefore unable to be fully described directly. Without sensory systems to interpret reality, it's a meaningless jumble of information. The universe is invisible if no eyes exist to see it, silent if no ears exist to hear it. Even when we interpret reality through our senses, it is still abstract. The raw sensory data we take in has no inherent meaning. However, there are enough patterns in the sensory data we take in that we can describe certain strands or lumps of reality using language. Language is an immensely useful tool for making sense of the sensory information we take in. It is so useful that we as humans have learned to think primarily in language. However, language is not reality itself. It is the map, not the road. Reality precedes the language we use to describe it, not the other way around. A metaphor I quite like is that language is a finger that points towards something, It is important to make sure that the finger is pointing as accurately as possible, but it is foolish to obsess over it rather than looking into the distance to see what it's pointing at. Language is not the only way that we interpret reality as we experience it. It is a kind of understanding that sits at the surface of our consciousness, and there are other layers of understanding below that. To use a very simple example, if you've ever dropped your mobile phone and then caught it before you realized what was going on, you've had some experience of this. When you drop your phone, you don't consciously think, "Oh no, I've dropped my phone. It could be damaged by a fall from this height onto the kind of surface I'm standing on. It's a very valuable object too, so repairing or replacing it would be costly both in time, money, and decision-making energy. I must move my hand into its path with haste." You just instinctively try and catch it. Your brain has categorized your phone as a fragile object of value ahead of time, and it bypasses your normal decision-making processes and acts on a kind of pre-rational level. We are making all kinds of assessments unconsciously through our biases and conclusions we've reached without conscious introspection. This is where instinct and intuition exist. I've heard people argue that intuition doesn't really exist because it can give insights that shouldn't be possible. But I think, at least in part, that's just because our unconscious is better at recognizing patterns than we give it credit for. Just because we can't identify or articulate those patterns doesn't mean that they aren't there. Your mind just doesn't always show it's working out. I've also heard people, many of which are the same ones that don't like the idea of intuition, argue that things like free will or consciousness are merely illusions, largely because they aren't materially measurable. I feel like this argument is bordering on gaslighting. We know we're conscious and have free will because it describes a discernible part of our subjective experience of existence. Even if we are no more than complex machines incapable of consciousness per se, we still experience these things. Consciousness and free will may not literally exist, but they are so fundamental to our experience that even if they don't exist, they may as well. Another, possibly clearer example of things that exist in this more subjective way is the concept of the unconscious. It's not a thing that tangibly or even necessarily literally exists. You cannot dissect a brain and remove the unconscious. You may be able to take an MRI reading and observe which parts of the brain are firing when the unconscious mind is active, but that still places it in the category of phenomena, not tangible things. And yet, as a metaphor, it's an incredibly useful conceptual tool to frame, describe, and often improve our experience of being. So does it really exist? I would argue that effectively, it does. I can talk about it, as I am now, and trust that you understand at least some approximation of what I mean, the same way that I can talk about you, me, understand, approximation, or mean. Did we have an unconscious before we had a word for it if it's just a subjectively experienced phenomenon? I argued that we did. There are many abstract, intangible things that we currently experience subjectively that we don't yet have words for, but exist nonetheless. That is to say, we have not yet developed a metaphor or narrative that separates that part of our experience from the rest of our nebulous subjective experience. People were depressed before we had an idea of depression, for example. We were making art before we had a concept of art. We experience things now that we cannot yet sufficiently describe with language, but someday will. Reality doesn't change just because our language, metaphor, or narrative does. Our will and consciousness happen to be crucial, though abstract, parts of our existence for which the West does not currently have an effective accepted metaphor. Again, even if these things do not literally exist, they certainly seem to, and they are experiences, illusions or not, that we deal with constantly as beings. Something guides us, if we listen to it, towards self-actualization. Something means that we get more joy from some things than others. Something gives us a sense of justice and morality. Something, if we are so lucky, connects us to a sense of purpose that is both particular to us as individuals and common to every member of the human race. That is why, regardless of your metaphysical precepts, a metaphor for these things is necessary. This is where religion traditionally steps in, and where materialistic science must bow out. This is not at all to dismiss science, but to point out that wisdom lies outside of its jurisdiction. That belongs to philosophy and spirituality. A conception of God or a pantheon of gods give us an effective framework to discuss morality. The idea of spirit or the soul gives us a framework to explore our consciousness, will, and connection to purpose. There is something that knows when we are engaged in a process of self-actualizing, and there is something consistent about the way people self-actualize. There is some kind of force at play, literal or otherwise. The purpose of spirituality is to attune us to this guiding force. This force is the thing towards which the metaphors of different religions are pointing, though they have a habit of overstating the importance of their own particular metaphor. God precedes religion the same way that reality precedes language. They are all getting at the same kind of spiritual truth. If you utilize the elephant parable, you can come to see quite clearly that there is more overlap between the beliefs of different religions than there are differences in many respects. They are all fingers pointing roughly at the same thing, blind people describing different parts of the same elephant. By considering different interpretations of God, we can get different parts of the elephant, different pieces of spiritual truth. They all teach us the importance of love, selflessness, reverence for nature, and some form of asceticism. Through the commonalities, there is a clear picture of God that emerges, though very difficult to describe due to its particularly abstract nature. Hence the metaphors of religions existing in the first place. Now, if you're non-spiritual, the whole idea of God and spirituality may be one you're uncomfortable with taking as an assumption. If you are in that category, I put it to you that the very idea of God itself is a metaphor for something that exists more tangibly within our makeup as human beings. If you place stock in evolution, and if you're non-spiritual, I feel that's a fair assumption, then you may be more comfortable with the idea that spirituality, though not necessarily organized religion in this case, is something we have developed through evolution because it helps guide us socially towards survival. We have not evolved to understand ourselves, but to survive. Why are there atheist humans? If there is no God, what drives us to be kind to people at all? The answer, as always in evolutionary theory, is survival. Our morality, compassion, and instinctive understanding of good come from an unconscious understanding of what we must do in order that our community, indeed our species, can thrive in the long term. So which is it then? Is it God or is it evolution? It doesn't matter. The result is the same. There is a lot of overlap between different religions and between religion and atheistic humanism. This is because it comes from the same unconscious understanding. Regardless of where it has come from, we all understand on some level what good is. It's the difference between seeking joy and seeking pleasure. It's the difference between feeling good after exercising and feeling good while eating fried food. We know when what we are doing is healthy because it feels better on an almost spiritual level. The human spirit that tells us when things are good or unhealthy remains the same regardless of where it came from or how literally it exists. We were made to experience it, and things are better in the long term when we listen to it. No ideology has a monopoly on that idea. We don't need to get the metaphor perfect to access this part of ourselves, and obsessing over the metaphor is like staring at a pointing finger rather than what it's looking at. Let me be a bit more concrete. Within Christianity, which is the religious metaphor I am most intimate with, there is the idea of the fruits of the Spirit. This basically just means the good things that happen when you're on the right track. I love this as a tool because it cuts through all the rules that were meant for one time and place but not another. And you can use this within any belief system. The way it works is, there is a list of some examples of positive traits that will start manifesting themselves in you and those around you when you are most aligned with the part of God that dwells within all people. The traits listed in the Bible are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faith, humility, and self-control. This is not a complete list, but that certainly gives you the kind of flavor of things to watch for. It's quite similar to the idea of you reap what you sow in secular culture, or, at least in a way, of karma in Eastern religion. It's simple to the point of being obvious. When things get bad, we get depressed, anxious, angry, afraid, sad, numb, and so on. When things are good, we feel alive, we're content, energetic, optimistic, empowered. We know what is good on some kind of spiritual level, and we know it is what being human is about. And yet, our understanding goes even deeper than this. We often don't need to wait for good or bad things to come to fruition. We seem to have some sense of what's right on a pre-rational level. For example, if we were to look at the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, we might theoretically argue that we could deforest the entire Amazon rainforest so long as we planted enough trees elsewhere to balance out the carbon sink. The rational response is to point out that you would be destroying an entire ecosystem, which is morally reprehensible. But where is the logic and morality? Who cares? Destroying an ecosystem doesn't affect us. We don't live in the Amazon. Why is that wrong? I could write another essay going into the full reasoning for why it would be wrong to do so, but ultimately, part of us bypasses all that and already knows. Either because God put us in charge of nature and gave us this instinct to help us stay on track, or because we evolved to feel bad about destroying ecosystems because it will eventually come back to harm us, our community, or the entire species in the future. It doesn't matter. The result is the same. It's wrong. We already know it. I'm always astounded by how connected children are to this part of themselves. Young children love nature and are far more likely to be upset by a tree being cut down, or by learning that there is a meat industry killing animals by the millions, or even just witnessing injustice among peers. The older we get, the more we learn to take for granted the way the world is, and the less its injustices shock us. Not only that, but the more pain we go through as we live in the world, the more defenses we develop in order to cope. These defenses include things like passive-aggressive behavior, for which we may be rewarded by having our feelings validated, or a reliance on status symbols to validate our own self-worth, or a substance dependency that soothes us or helps us avoid the raw pain that exists within us. These are learned behaviors and are tools that we use to protect ourselves from pain or to get what we want. And yet, through all those layers that we build up over time, we can still access that pre-rational part of ourselves that knows what is good and right. On some level, we already understand. No group of people has or can have a monopoly on this, and regardless of your metaphor, the result is the same. Listen to the part of yourself that knows what is good. I could finish here, but there's much more to be said about the human condition. There is more even merely to my part of the elephant. I believe the best way to talk about this is by using a new metaphor that doesn't already carry social baggage. I would like to propose, at least for the purposes of this essay, a new, non-sectarian paradigm to describe this channel of being. This new paradigm is not literally speaking true, the same way that the unconscious is not. This is all a metaphor to explain my understanding of how we operate in relation to the human spirit or one's verve, hence the name Vervism. The Vervist Paradigm. When creating a metaphor to contextualize the subjective experience of the self, it is often useful to divide it into parts. It seems to be inherent to the human condition that there is a sense of inner conflict and contradiction, so it makes sense for any metaphor of the self to be multifaceted or compartmentalized. Rather than imagining ourselves as a single unified being, we might view ourselves as a community trying to function in harmony, or as an actor inhabiting different roles at different times, though often involuntarily. This is the type of image used within the Vervist paradigm. Within this framework, we exist at any given time within one of the following four states or selves: magnificent, mortal, wounded, and fallen. Each has its own relationship to Verve, or the human spirit. The magnificent self. The first is the magnificent self, or existing in a magnificent state. This is who we are when we are fully aligned with Verve. As I've discussed already, Verve tells us what is healthy in a spiritual or even literal sense. But it is more than that. There is a way in which Verve instructs us as individuals and interacts with our unique personalities. For example, being a loving parent is a Vervist attribute in that I think it would be broadly accepted as positive. However, there is some people who feel particularly moved to be parents and to be totally devoted to their family unit. Eating wholesome food and sharing it as a meal with other people is a Vervist activity, but not all of us feel compelled to dedicate ourselves to becoming chefs. Verve not only instructs a kind of primal, instinctive morality, but it can also clarify individual purpose. This is perhaps most visible in artists. The definition of art is so nebulous and its purpose so abstract that if it can even be defined or has purpose, it can be very difficult for an artist to articulate what they are trying to achieve or why they are doing it. There is little to no social incentive to becoming an artist, with the vast majority of them existing on minuscule incomes and working additional jobs to support themselves. And yet, despite everything, people continue to dedicate themselves to making art. The reason why is because of verve. There is something in their human spirit that compels them, and if they deny this compulsion, they inevitably begin to disintegrate as people, even more so than during the bouts of doubt that inevitably come with doing something with little social or rational justification. Similarly, some scientists have made rationalizations for wanting to explore the wider universe. This usually involves an argument along the lines of ensuring the long-term survival of our species in case Earth becomes uninhabitable. However, this is not why some have dedicated their lives to space exploration. Were that the case, talk of interplanetary discovery would be riddled with existential anxiety. The reason we explore space, and many science communicators trade on this, is because it inspires a sense of wonder. We explore space for the same reason we make art, because it aligns us with verve. It is very likely that in your own experience you can recall an instance where you've had a sense of being exactly where you need to be and doing exactly what you should be doing as the person you are or are meant to be. This does not necessarily need to relate to your individual purpose. It could be a time when you were helping someone through a tough time and you inexplicably had the right words or knew what to do. The key is that it was an experience that made you feel transcendentally alive. This is what a magnificent state is. It is the part of us that is deeply moved by art, the part of us that falls in love rather than simply being infatuated. It is true empathy with other people's pain and joy. It's altruism and self-sacrifice. It is true essence. It is the transcendental self. It is the self in the Jungian sense. It is almost impossible to describe, but very easy to understand once experienced. The goal is to spend as much of our lives in this state as we can and to chase it wherever we see it. It is often accompanied by a feeling that everyone is connected, the sense that we are all one, connected by a great something. For the religious, it is God or a pantheon of gods that connects us. For the atheistic, it is often the universe. Science communicators have often remarked that we are made from the material that comes from stars. We are made of star stuff. This taps into a similar kind of connection and sense of awe as God does for religious folk. It seems as though connection to the infinite, be it God or the universe, is a crucial aspect of awakening the human spirit and is an important part of transcending into a magnificent state. Connection to the infinite does not mean that we must lose our individuality. Individuality, too, has a place in the magnificent self. In Christianity, there is the image of the body, in which we are all different body parts with different functions and requiring different treatment. If all the parts function as they should, the body as a whole functions as it should. If we are aligned to verve, we will fulfill the individual role that we are supposed to play in the greater body in order for it to function properly. Through an atheistic existentialist lens in which there is no divine bestowing of purpose, there might seem to be a risk that there will not be a proper balance of individual roles in a society for it to function. I would propose that this is where faith in the evolutionary process ought to come in. One would think that human groupings should have evolved over time to tend towards having an equilibrium of interests and talents within a community to allow a good chance of its survival. Once again, it doesn't matter what your metaphor is, what we ought to do is the same. The mortal self. The mortal self or state is the most mundane. It is what you think of by default when you conceptualize yourself. The mortal self is capable of doing good, but it is not a transcendent state. When things take conscious effort to do, that effort comes from the mortal self. Unlike the magnificent self, the good that is done while in this state is neither transcendent nor effortless. The mortal self is closely equated with the ego, both in the Freudian sense and in the contemporary spiritualist sense. It is the benign person you are on a day-to-day basis. The wounded self. The wounded self is born out of trauma, pain, or the fear of trauma or pain. I mentioned in the Philosophical Underpinnings chapter that as we grow, we build defenses to protect ourselves. We enter a wounded state when we utilize these defenses unnecessarily, or when we use them to an excessive degree. Having these defenses is not a bad thing in and of itself. Most people experience trauma and must find a way to survive. The trouble is that when we use these defenses unnecessarily, we can find ourselves lashing out, cutting ourselves off, being passive-aggressive, manipulative, self-important, selfish, paralyzed, demotivated, distant, or exhibiting any number of destructive behaviors that hurt others or ourselves. Sometimes we build these defenses not because of trauma, but rather because we have grown up in a sheltered environment and don't trust that we can survive experiences outside of our comfort zone. This can lead to many of the same effects. In both cases, our defenses go up quicker than is helpful, and we end up hurting others. For example, if someone has grown up in an environment of plenty, it does not take a lot of scarcity to set alarm bells ringing. They may be more likely to take from others in order to have what they feel is enough. In another case, someone who has suffered verbal abuse may be more likely to lash out preemptively to avoid being the victim of an anticipated barrage. Someone who has lost a loved one at a young age may develop a fear of abandonment, which may mean they become hostile to someone they think is about to leave or betray them. Someone who has felt trapped by the violent emotions of those around them may wish to disappear to avoid conflict, only to become distant to friends and family who may need them. These kinds of behaviors can very easily trigger the defenses of the person or people we are reacting to and cause more meaningless conflict. In other cases, it can actively harm someone around us who is in no way a threat, either by aggression or neglect, and inflict a new wound on them against which they will learn to protect themselves. These kinds of behaviors can very easily trigger the defenses of the person or people we are reacting to and cause meaningless conflict. In other cases, it can actively harm someone around us who is in no way a threat, either by aggression or neglect, and inflict a new wound on them against which they will learn to protect themselves. In the case of parents, children may learn to imitate defenses against traumas they have not experienced themselves, which they will then enact throughout their lives unnecessarily. In all cases, the hurt spreads. Everyone has received their wound from someone else, who in turn received it from someone else, and so on. It is not the fault of an injured person that they bear an injury. The best way we have to prevent both ourselves and others from getting hurt is through healing, and the first step towards healing is understanding. This is often very difficult as, again, we are built to survive but not to understand ourselves. Identifying and clarifying the wound takes incredible insight. However, if you have the wherewithal to ask yourself in any given moment if you are being motivated more by your magnificent self or your wounded self, you should be able to discern. From there, you may be able to identify the patterns that will bring you closer to understanding your own pain and your defenses against it. You should also show the same courtesy to others, and view their negative behavior as an attempt to protect themselves against a threat that isn't there. A good question to ask yourself of other people who act cruelly or carelessly is, what kind of pain must this person be in? This is a good first step towards understanding, which is the first stage of healing. When dealing with our wound, it is tempting to turn to things that soothe us, instead of seeking healing, which is often painful. This too can lead to very unhealthy patterns of behavior, such as addiction. It's not uncommon to hear things like, the brain in love is like the brain on cocaine, but I think it's better to think of it in reverse. Cocaine mimics love, not the other way around. There is a certain neurological ecosystem within all of us, and we know when it's out of balance. The trouble is, there are many unsustainable ways of trying to balance it. This is why drug, alcohol, gambling, and sex addictions are so destructive. They are soothing the pain without healing the wound. There's an often cited experiment known as the rat park experiment, in which rats were made to become addicted to cocaine and soon chose it over food. However, the experiment was conducted in a bare cage with nothing but food and drug dispensers. When another experiment was done in an environment where the rats could play and socialize, they had what they needed and no longer got addicted to cocaine. Their neurological ecosystems were balanced and did not need the cocaine to compensate. Finding solutions to soothe our pain is sometimes necessary to survive for a time, but it is no substitute for real healing. Through healing, we can be controlled less by our pain and be more able to seek the magnificent. It is important to have some access to your magnificent self when healing. Ridding yourself of any part of your identity that you have cultivated around your wound will not be sustainable if you don't have a new identity to replace it with. Finding things that connect you with your magnificent self is perhaps more crucial than healing, though it should be seen as a necessary step between understanding and the process of actually healing. The fallen self. I did not originally include this state in the paradigm, but the more I thought about it, the less able I felt to include it as part of the wounded self. The fallen state is the darkest state a person can be in. When someone becomes fixated on their wounds to the point that protecting themselves against pain takes over their whole being, they enter a fallen state. The wounded self is responsible for moments of weakness. The fallen self emerges when the pain from the wound metastasizes to infect almost every aspect of life. In this state, connection to Verve and the infinite is basically impossible. There is little to no real joy to be had. The person may detach from reality and find themselves becoming paranoid. They may become obsessed with acquiring power to no end and at any cost to others. They may become incapable of empathy. They may create endless fabrications to manipulate people in order to get what they want. There are many number of ways in which a fallen state may manifest, but we can recognize them because something has so clearly gone wrong. Those in a fallen state are not beyond help, but it is not as simple as just healing the wound. There is far more damage control involved, because the people around those in a fallen state will need to be protected. Someone in a fallen state will need to become vulnerable in order to undergo a healing process, and vulnerability is what the fallen self fears most. People in a fallen state will do anything they can to avoid emotional pain, which is why power is often so important to them. They will lie and manipulate for social and political gain in order to create protective barriers of status and wealth between themselves and some imagined enemy. They will propagandize and spread beliefs that are almost always harmful in order to attack others, believing that if they have power over everyone else, no one can harm them. People in the state are very destructive, so it's important to take the utmost care around them. Accurately discerning whether someone is in a fallen state is vitally important. If you are overly trusting, you leave yourself vulnerable to harm, but if you are not trusting enough, you might inflict further wounds on a potentially vulnerable person. A good tool for discernment is examining what the person might gain from holding their beliefs. If you cannot see what they might gain, tend towards belief. I personally use a traffic light system for believing what people tell me. A green light is for things I feel I can trust completely, a red light is for things I cannot trust at all, and an amber light is for things that I am neither accepting nor dismissing, but waiting for more clarity before judging. It is important to give things you are not sure about an amber light when dealing with those in a fallen state. Healing. Because the fallen self is so destructive, it is vital that we seek to heal our own wounds and, where we are in a position to do so, the wounds of others, lest we or they enter a fallen state. It is therefore important to be patient with people who hurt you, understanding that they are acting out of their own hurt like a terrified child. The only way to stop the pain of the wound is with patience, understanding, and healing. The only way to stop the pain of the wound is with patience, understanding, and healing. This is all we have at our disposal to protect ourselves from those that might harm us. Healing can be a very confusing process. Because the wound exists on a pre-rational level, it can be difficult to reason with directly, and the emotions attached to it can manifest in seemingly unrelated places. Emotions are often effects looking for causes, and will find an opening for expression through anything that might be emotionally relevant rather than rationally causal. This is the mechanism that triggers our defenses unnecessarily. If something happens that feels like the pain of our wound, we react against it. Our emotions, just like our other senses, only gives us one channel to experience reality. It is necessary to accurately identify our wound in whatever way we can so that we may heal. Unfortunately, this means going into some painful territory. It is much like cleaning a physical wound. We must move into the pain despite our instinct to recoil, but we must interrogate our pain and ask questions like, what am I really afraid of? Even if it means pushing through the most painful things we carry with us. While this pain is related to the wound and is some of the most severe, it is also related to the magnificent self. The pain of healing is magnificent pain, and we can feel it both internally and in empathy for others. Understanding brings healing. Understanding cannot happen without belief. When people tell you something in good faith, it is important to believe them as much as possible. Do not expect them to have the whole elephant, but remember that what they share is still a piece of the puzzle with some kind of truth to it. This kind of trust can help you step around other people's defenses, and if you are in a position to do so, aid in their healing. The path towards healing can be psychological, spiritual, or both. Because the wound exists on a sublinguistic level, there are two ways to approach healing. One is to find language to articulate the wound and the way it affects you. Even having the initial framework of understanding it as your wounded self can help you be more aware of it and to articulate it. This is similar to the ideas central to cognitive behavioral therapy. The other way towards healing is by bypassing language. This is where spiritual practice and things like hypnotherapy can be very effective. The subconscious responds to experiences, so to heal the subconscious, it may be necessary to have an experience of healing. Therapies such as compassion-focused therapy and hypnotherapy are useful tools that bypass language and speak directly to the unconscious mind. Far be it from me to say what the right way to go about healing would be for any given person. That is something everyone must find for themselves, as only we have direct access to our own wounds and to our verve which can guide us towards healing. I can, however, vouch for meditation as a useful practice. Meditation works as mental training in a similar way to a physical workout. You spend a little time each day bringing attention away from thoughts and instead focusing on breathing, a mantra, or a voice in the case of guided meditation. You will inevitably become distracted by thoughts, but the point of meditation isn't to keep your mind from being distracted, it's to build up the mental muscle of letting go of your thoughts. Each time you return your attention, you're doing a rep. This is the kind of ability that helps in things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is designed to help people let go of unhelpful thoughts. Such therapies are much easier to undertake if you're already well practiced at letting go of your thoughts in general through meditation. By utilizing practices like meditation and cognitive behavioral therapy, you can build up your ability to simply observe your thoughts without engaging with them. If you can learn to do this, it becomes much easier to see what bubbles up to the surface of your consciousness from your wound without being controlled by its pain and fear. If you can achieve healing within yourself, you can work towards reducing the suffering in those around you. It will take time, so be patient with yourself and with others. Regularly commune with the infinite, whatever that may mean for you. Do the best you can with the resources and perspectives you have, and trust that others are doing the same. And when you meet with someone, I hope you can trust them enough to listen to them and believe what they tell you about their experience of the elephant. They wake the next morning and share breakfast. One hungover, one groggy, one sober.